kilometers south of Angkor Wat, in the Tonle Sap Lake. The lake is connected by the Tonle Sap River to the Mekong. But in the summer, the volume of tropical rains combined with runoff from the Himalayas pushes up the Tonle Sap River into the lake, drowning forests of trees and quadrupling its size. And when the lake retreats, vast plains are covered with fertile earth for rice cultivation. Suryavarman's subjects cultivate 2 and sometimes even 3 harvests of rice a year. Not only can Suryavarman feed his workers, but there is also surplus production. While much of the world is practicing subsistence agriculture, Suryavarman generates revenue to pay for mega projects like Angkor Wat and for wars against his neighbors. Just as one cannot conceive of the Egyptian empire without the Nile, the great floodplain of the Tonle Sap feeds the growth of the Khmer kingdom and the megacity at its heart. The scope and scale of the Khmer Empire means that Suryavarman's workers have many great building traditions to draw from as they construct the temple. The height of the 1,532 columns means that the stone-on-stone friction is not enough to keep the features of the temples safely in place. Suryavarman's engineers rely on another great building tradition, carpentry.
The temples themselves were all constructed in stone, but the people lived in homes made of wood. They were great woodworkers. We know what the houses and palaces looked like because we have them represented on some of their stone reliefs.
Looking at these pieces of carved stone, it is clear how woodworking influenced the way the stone was cut and carved.
You can see how they were decorated and chiseled away in just the same way that the wood was chiseled into patterns and forms.
The techniques of joining the stones show a similar influence.
You can see the way that the timber would have been a prototype to the way in which the stone was also cut so that you could have neat and mortise and tenon jointing. And so the woodworker and the stoneworker were working in harmony, one with the other.
Based on their knowledge of how shapes interlocked and exploiting the natural weight and friction between stones, Suryavarman's teams produced the soaring details that make Angkor Wat famous. This extends to the roof of the structure as well. As the walls of the Great Temple near completion, they appear to ignore one of the most elemental and effective building techniques available: the keystone arch. This could be because the arch creates its own engineering problems.
Everyone knows that the arch is a wonderful structural device. It's very efficient, it's used all over the place, but it does have some downsides. And one of the downsides that the arch has is that in order to work, it has to resist big pushes out at the end. So if I have an arch like this, it wants to go like that and it pushes out like my elbows are going out there. And so you need to apply large horizontal thrusts at the end.
To get around this problem, the distinctive tops of the towers at Angkor Wat are examples of a building technique called corbelling.
Corbelling is a technique that anyone with small kids with blocks will have seen in action many times, and it involves the placing of a block and then another one slightly offset from it, another one slightly offset from it, to a point where the thing begins to span out.
Unlike European structures such as cathedrals, whose roofs had to span large spaces, Khmer architecture favors corridors and small meeting rooms. This made corbelling a viable alternative.
It's sometimes dangerous, and mistakes have been made by architects who come from Europe and look at it and go, "What do you mean there's no radiating joint in an arch? The joints are flat. That's mad. That's not structurally, that isn't in my engineering manual. It doesn't work." Wait a minute, we've got the biggest stone temple in the world. Nobody else has built anything bigger. It must work.
So by playing to the specific needs of their temple, the Khmer constructed countless corbelled structures, creating their own distinctive architectural style. But as they complete the Temple Mountain, the sand core pushes out against the laterite and sandstone encased walls. The outward thrust might have started to push it out of shape. The Khmer would have to implement a solution, or else the entire structure will crumble into a heap of sand and stone blocks.
Most building in stone is trial and error. When they were building the Gothic cathedrals, they would very often build them as high as they could before they started to fall down. And that was as high as they could get, and then they'd stop.
The tons of sand contained within the laterite forms are pushing constantly against the stone. Surya Varman's engineers will need to reinforce the laterite walls and keep their soaring temple mountain intact. Their solution takes the modern visitor to the most sacred part of the Angkor Wat site, once off limits to anyone but the highest priests.
These steps must rank amongst the steepest in the world, and it would have been very, very hard for an old priest or an old king even to get up them. In fact, one has to go up them almost pigeon-toed to make it to the top. But on the right and the left-hand sides, there are these great buttresses, and these buttresses are almost certainly weight-bearing to take the enormous thrust of the weight of the stone and to distribute it as you come down so that the building would in fact last, and last it has, for almost 1,000 years.
At almost exactly the same time that the French architects of Chartres used their flying buttresses, Khmer engineers adopt a similar principle. Thrust met by counter-thrust, half a world away in Southeast Asia. Yet before visitors to the site see the soaring Temple Mountain, they must first cross its famous moat. Damien Evans argues that the moat and temple are in fact two separate feats of engineering.
You have the construction of the temple, which would have itself taken probably decades and involved hundreds of thousands of people. And then all around outside of that temple, you have an equally impressive feat, which is the construction of this moat. And again, would have involved the labor of hundreds of thousands of people over the course of many decades.
Now that the moat has been completed, like the temple walls, it will be lined with sandstone. However, these blocks are even larger, and workers have to line both the inside and outside perimeters with a beautiful stone, transported from the Kulin Hills, then moved into place.
So you can imagine the amount of effort and energy that would have been involved in bringing these enormous stones down from such a distance down to the edge of this moat. It really is truly one of the most amazing engineering feats in human history.
From the moat to the roof, the Khmer use sandstone everywhere. The famous corbelling now visible on the insides of the temple is topped on the outside by these interlocking roof stones. Modern-day restoration work reveals how the Khmer tailored their roofing techniques to the monsoon climate, where water posed an ongoing threat to the structure's survival.
Now let's have a look in the...
Previous attempts to renovate show the dangers of applying Western methods of construction to such a resolutely Eastern building. Back in the 1980s, after a major restoration to the temple, the roof stones were re-erected and then sealed together with cement to keep the rains out. Unfortunately, that solution caused the corrosive chemicals in the cement to bleed into the temple, threatening some of its famous bas-reliefs. The most important of which is the great tableau known as the Churning of the Sea of Milk. In it, the gods and the demons vie for immortality, each side tugging at the end of a serpent wrapped around a mountain. At the center is Vishnu, protector of Surya Varman. By pulling for 1,000 years, the gods and demons rotate the mountain, stirring up the elixir of life from the bottom of the ocean. The action creates the Apsaras, who occupy the upper sections of the relief.
So this great tableau is presented within one gallery that is arguably the finest work of ancient Khmer sculpture. The problem is that the roof system over this precious bas-relief leaks, carrying with it damaging salts and water and light and biological growth and the like.
A more holistic approach now studies how the original roof stones were designed to function. Conservationist Long Neri describes the internal drainage system built within the roof to whisk water away from the structure.
If the water still infiltrate from the joint, open joint anyhow, the water will not run directly into the inside structure, but it will run through this small channel out from the building.
The cement filled the narrow channels, and cracks formed, causing leaks. They had a major problem on their hands. A restoration is now underway. The roof stones are being removed and lowered to the ground. They show evidence of scaling and salts damage. At nearby workstations, the stones are individually cleaned and the faulty mortar removed, restoring the original channels. Repairs are made and the stone itself sealed to protect it from the elements. Eventually, the stones will be lifted back into place. A fitting legacy to the brilliance of Khmer building techniques, which has lasted for centuries. For almost 900 years, thousands of stones that make up the great temple of Angkor Wat have remained in perfect alignment, protecting the integrity of its bas-reliefs and other carvings. These carvings are intended to provide Surya Varman with an entourage in the afterlife. But Surya Varman is growing old. Will he live long enough to see his grand vision complete? If he does not, he will lose his chance at heaven. Surya Varman's builders race against time to finish the temple before his death. However, there is evidence to suggest that they were not fully successful. These incomplete bas-reliefs reveal that the project was not fully completed. But Charles Hyam does believe that the temple performed its ultimate function and was ready to receive Surya Varman's ashes after his death.
When the king died, he would have been cremated, he would have been turned into ashes, but he was still alive. He had a new name, Parama Vishnu Loka, he who has gone to live with Vishnu.
He points to evidence of the burial process, intended to turn the king into a living god found on the site.
And so the ashes were placed in a great stone casket. Some of those stone caskets have survived. One of them was actually found here, but it was in the wrong place. It had been moved. And so when the ashes in the stone casket were placed dead center under the central tower, then, as they say, the statue of Vishnu, the god king, represented in stone, eyes were opened and the king lived.
Surya Varman may have been safely buried, but the very system that allowed him to build Angkor Wat and its amazing hydraulic city may have contained the seeds of the Khmer Empire's doom. Angkor's vaunted water systems, its canals and reservoirs and irrigation channels, grew more complex to support the sprawling megacity. Huge tracts of land had been clear-cut for temples, homes, and farming, allowing silt to build up on the canals and reservoirs during the rainy season. With a growing populace and deforestation stretching the jungle's resources, massive engineering suddenly gave way to over-engineering.
As we see the system becoming more and more complex, we start to see evidence of adaptations, people trying to patch things up, the system becoming more and more complex and unworkable.
Overwhelmed by such a high-maintenance water system, food production and transportation may have gradually started to fail. The Khmer's brilliantly constructed system reached a breaking point.
My own theory is that, like so many other civilizations, it got to be so wealthy and so grand and so complicated that it became irresistible as a target for others. And eventually, through these ripe conditions, kings and rulers came along that just couldn't hold it all together. And after successive attempts, perhaps, by neighboring cultures,